Well, first I want to thank Janetta Fierro most warmly for arranging today's session and inviting me here. I know she had to overcome one or two obstacles, including the fact that she had to chase more than two biologists around the corner before she could find someone willing to face the dreaded Dr. Hovind in a creation evolution debate. Now, she didn't have to chase me too far because I've already debated the man back in April. And so I had some sense of what to expect. And he's a formidable opponent. He uses PowerPoint, he's got jokes, he's scavenged and collected a whole series of facts, pseudo-facts, misinterpreted facts, etc. to create a certain impression, and he's impressive at doing it. But you know, I believe in learning from others, and I believe that I may have learned more from Dr. Hovind than he's learned from me. In any case, I'm eager for round two of our match, or the rematch after the first match, and I'm delighted to be invited, and I thank you and your family for arranging this event. I hope you, well, I'll skip that. Let me just say at the outset that we operate a little bit differently. I'm a scientist, and under no circumstances is the theory of evolution under attack within science. Dr. Hovind may seek to create a different impression on this, but evolutionary theory, evolutionary biology, evolutionary genetics, and now this is going on. The others, it's working, sorry, have been well established. They're a growing discipline which serve the test of science, which is if we can successfully predict new phenomena and interpret existing phenomena successfully. Dr. Hovind is, by his own admission, an evangelist, and he goes about trying to He goes about, quote, trying to strengthen the faith of the believer, confound and convict the evolutionist, and win the lost to Christ. I'm not trying to do any of those things. In particular, I'm trying as a scientist to figure out what's true. And I cannot concern myself with whether what I find out to be true or believe to be true shapes your faith or strengthens your faith. And I think you don't want your scientists big in science based on trying to prop up people's faith. If science took that approach, the sun would still be circling the earth. And various other discoveries would be muted or never made because of the possibility that it would shake someone's faith. If your faith is weakened by knowledge of how the universe actually works, it's a problem for you to deal with. If you wish to come to me and ask how I've dealt with the same problem, I'm only too happy to share my thoughts. But I cannot take that viewpoint at the outset. I'm not trying to confound or conflict anybody or convict anyone. As for winning the lost to Christ, let's discuss what that means exactly a little bit later on. Let me just emphasize at the outset what this is not. This is not a debate between godless atheism and religion. It is not a debate between Christianity and evolution. The reason why it isn't is because evolution is as fully consistent with God existing as it is with God not existing. In fact, it's probably, in my opinion, more fully consistent with God existing. But I, as a scientist, could never prove that point and won't pretend that I could. More specifically, there is no contradiction between Christianity and evolution unless you take a particular, I believe, very narrow, distorted image of Christianity. That every word of the book that I hold in my hands, the Bible, means exactly what I tell you it does. Which, in my view, directly contradicts the teachings of Jesus. So the kind of Christianity that is pervaded as being anti-evolutionary and protest and so on, to me, is inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. Now, can you be an evolutionist and a Christian? Of course you can. Many have been, many are. I'll give you one local example. Myself. Until the age of 13, I only studied one book seriously, and that was the Bible, under the tutelage of my mother. Now, at age 13, I discovered astronomy, and the vastness and the beauty and the majesty of this universe were overwhelming and overpowering. Did that challenge my faith? Did I fall back and say, Jesus, you're losing your grip on me? Of course not. Quite the contrary. It made God's majesty, if you believe in God, only the greater. And furthermore, although it shrunk human beings, was that anti-Christian? Of course not. Jesus emphasized humility, not arrogance and pride, and the absence of self-centeredness. Stop this Israelites always talking about themselves and not seeing other people, etc. Try to come to a general set of principles that work for everyone. Now, later when I learned biology, there was a similarly vast story about the life here on Earth. 4 billion years, etc. So I was not so much attracted by the beauty and grandeur of that story, although it has all of that, but by the fact that it provided a logic, evolution through natural selection, that you could use to interpret the meaning of biological characters, the meaning of living characteristics. Now, there are two kinds of creationists that exist these days. There are the intelligent designers and the recent creationists. The intelligent designers accept physics, they accept chemistry, they accept astrophysics, they accept astronomy, they accept geology, they accept paleontology, they accept organic evolution. They just say that God has been behind the whole thing, that the whole universe and life is intelligently designed. I have no quarrel with that viewpoint. It doesn't brush up against my science exactly, because it would be very hard to define the work that would show you where the intelligent design was different from non-intelligent design or whatnot. But it is fully consistent with everything we know about the Earth and the universe. Now, the recent creationist, of which Dr. Hovind is a well-known example, they take a much different position. They dismiss all those disciplines that I mentioned, and want to base their view of the Earth, of theology, of astronomy, etc., on a few lines in Genesis. And in particular, they want to explain the entire paleontological record, as I'll come back to in a moment, by the flood, by Noah's flood. Now this, from my standpoint, is an extraordinary fantasy. That Noah's flood and ark are a plausible account of the fossil record, and life we know it today is beyond credulity. And I will then come to that evidence. But I will just stress at the outset that to me there are two very different views of the universe here that are being described, and of the God that's behind the universe, if such a God is there. On the one hand, I believe in a consistent, rational, sensible world without dreadful, inexplicable calamities that destroy 99.9% of the species, all because human beings weren't behaving themselves properly. By contrast, Dr. Hovind believes in an arbitrary, bizarre, capricious world according to a private interpretation of a privately held book in which God creates the whole universe and then obliterates whole sections of it in a mad 300 days because of disputes with the behavior of human beings and so on. All right, now let's get to the evidence. The fossil record. If there were no fossil record at all, and yet evolution were still true. For example, if living creatures, when they died, just pulverized, and so they could not leave an imprint, then it would still be difficult to prove evolution, although there would be many other proofs. But still you would say, where's something concrete I can look at? One of the most striking things is that life has left this imprint from earlier creatures, and this has been known and studied in depth for over 200 years now. And the vastness of the fossil record, for those of you who don't waste your time on this stuff, may be surprising. There are over 80 billion 80 billion fossils that have been discovered, and hundreds of millions that have been described, cataloged, placed in museum collections, assorted, organized by strata, organized by time, etc. This is not 5 or 6 fossils. This is not 12 fossils in the horse story or whatever. This is a massive record of past life, of creatures that are not here alive today, but were clearly alive at some point in the past. Now, how does Dr. Hovind deal with this? Well, according to him, we were all alive before the flood, but then along came the flood and wiped out all the ones that are found in the fossil record. Now that creates, in the flood, that creates a whole series of problems. For example, what's the size distribution of creatures as you go down geological strata? According to him, that's just all mud from the big flood, and they got killed and they died, and they got fossilized in different layers. We know that the denser you are, and also separately, the heavier you are, the more you will tend to sink to the bottom. That's not the way the fossils are organized. The largest mammals are very recent, near the top layers. The heavy creatures, elephants, and their relatives, etc., etc. Smaller mammals are lower down, even though we know smaller mammals are less dense and way less. It should not be in that order. So the size distribution is all. Secondly, dating. There are a whole series of methods, and this comes out of physics, chemistry, and so on, for dating rocks. Carbon-14 is one example. It works up to about 50,000 years ago. Argon, potassium is used if you want to go back a billion years. Now, Dr. Hovind is fond of pointing out inconsistencies in estimates. What he's done is gone and climbed around and found 20 estimates for carbon dating that are in contradiction. One says 3,000, the other says 30,000, even though one is the animal, the other is the bones of the same animal, and whatnot. But what he neglects to point out is that there are 50,000, 70,000 measurements of carbon dating. A whole world of consistent dating, which is in turn consistent with strata, older strata date to further in the past, etc. Now, scientists have a rule. If you have 50,000 observations in one direction and 5 in the other, you don't even pay attention to 5. If you have 50 or 100, you hardly pay attention to it. If you've got 50,000 in one direction and 5,000 in another, you've got a problem. You take it seriously and try to deal with the contradictions. So this is a fantasy on his part. There's no consistent series of dating that comes out of other disciplines in biology. There are minute details of the fossil record that are just absurd to imagine they resulted in one flood. For example, by our dating, scientists dating 70 million years ago, around the world, at strata that had the same kinds of creatures 70 million years ago, and date to 70 million years ago, you find a very thin layer of a chemical called iridium. And that's really dust. And what it is now believed is just a hypothesis at the time, but the evidence is growing to support it, is that came when a large meteor hit the Earth. It spewed up this iridium, which covered the Earth with it. It blotted out the sun for days and days and days. It was probably instrumental in bringing the dinosaurs to an end. How on earth, in this incredible flood, with all of this water heating up and down, are these little dust particles kept at the same level all the way around the Earth, and at the level that corresponds to 70 million years ago by scientific calculation? All right, secondly, I didn't know some of these things before I had debated the first time. I don't spend my life studying the arguments of traits of evolution. I'm all working in a particular area of evolutionary genetics now, and I've got to do my work. If you're going to get the water by raining 40 days and nights, it has to rain about 11 feet an hour. Remember, a minute an hour is a heavy downpour. 11 feet an hour would splat you to the ground as if it. Furthermore, and I didn't know this before debating this man the last time, it generates heat. The release of water in the atmosphere generates heat. That amount of water would result in water that came down at about 3,000 degrees temperature. So you've got a boiling mass of water. It's killing everything in the water. Not just the fossils, but any other fish except the sediment. How the humans survive, I don't know. Well, last time he dodged that by saying, well, you'll find one little half a line, and I'm checking this in Genesis, where it talks about water gushing out from every corner. So now he wants the water not just to come down from above, but to come from down below. But we know that any water that does come up from below is superheated and comes up boiling already. The molten core of this planet is only about 5 kilometers below sea level. And the Earth gets very warm very quickly. Now, where did all that water come from? Where did it all vanish to? You can't have that amount of water. Water is so massive that it comes to the top of Mount Everest. Water that's 5 miles high, and then suddenly disappears in the space of less than a year, according to Genesis. Where'd it go to? Back up into the atmosphere, down to the rocks. It had to go somewhere. We got no evidence of it. Now, thirdly, the massive murder of the flood. Well, skip the murder of all the species that are no longer with us. You had millions of species that had to be without food for about a year. It's a fantasy to believe that Noah and his brethren were collecting all this food from all these species. The seawater would have been diluted so that you wouldn't have had seawater with all this rainwater coming down. A whole bunch of fish cannot survive unless it's really seawater, etc. Number 4, let me give you another absurdity. 80% of our parasites, roughly, that is our diseases, viruses, bacteria, protozoa, worms, live inside us. Now another 20% can also be found in a vector, like malaria can be in us or it can be in a mosquito. Now that means, and this is true for all other creatures, that when we got together, Noah got together 2 lions, 2 leopards, 2 gazelles, 2 kangaroos, 2 bears. Each of them had to be sick unto death. One of them had to have 40% at least of the species diseases, and the other had to have another 40%. And somehow there they are, ill-fed, ill-cared for, having to walk back to Australia with their kangaroo. Meanwhile, it's got half the parasites almost of their species. Nothing like we've ever seen since. And what about the incredible arrival and departure that's suggested by this? Remember when Noah's flood was invented as a story, people didn't know the earth was round. They knew of the world a few tens of miles away from where they lived. They didn't know that kangaroos, which we know are found in fossil records in Australia, would have had to walk from Australia and walk back. Polar bears would have had to come down from the cold where they could live to the hot climate of the Middle East and somehow to find Noah and climb aboard and so on. Then at the end of this monstrous event with a cauldron of 3,000-degree water in which the ship is somehow maintaining itself, they got to wait till the water all disappears in some little rat hole that these people are imagining, and then they've got to walk back through all this blood and carnage of the dead, stinking creatures and so on. This is your view of how God created the universe, how it developed off of a little story in Genesis. And finally, before I turn to that story in Genesis, what about genetics? And I deliberately asked Dr. Hovind about it last time, and I will ask him about it very early on in my questions, because I know he hadn't been exposed to this before, so let's see how fast he learned from me. Remember, Noah and his children and their wives, that's what we have on the human side. All the other creatures were marched in 2 by 2. Well, what does that mean? That means they go back and breed. Then their children breed with each other, because there ain't no other line, right? Then their grandchildren breed with each other, because there ain't no other line. And every generation thereafter. And it's a trivial calculation to show, and we have evidence, I don't know how many bodies of evidence to show that it's true, that inbreeding obliterates genetic diversity within individuals. So every human being in this room, approximately, if you go down to your genotype and compare the genes you got from your mother, the genes you got from your father, at 10% of the loci, they'll be different. We are outbred species that benefit from outbreeding. We benefit from genetic diversity within ourselves. The world doesn't show that. That gets obliterated by inbreeding. You know the ill effects of post-inbreeding. You've certainly heard about it. You certainly know that that's the reason why we tend to avoid it. But if you keep it up, and it just takes a few generations, you can, in 12, 15 generations, without inbreeding, you can take that to 1/100th level. So instead of 10% of the loci being heterozygous, 1/10 of 1%. Yet if you look at all these creatures, a mere 4,000 years later or whatever, a mere 300 generations later, somehow they've all reconstituted the genetic variability that they lost in this inbreeding. Beyond credulity. Now, good, thank you. And I'll be done in 5 minutes. Now, there was a real flood back in that area of the world out of which the Bible came, and which many people believe is the reason for the flood story that you find in Genesis. One reason for this is that the same story is found in related peoples, different religions, different religious traditions, but they have a flood story. Occasionally you find a flood story elsewhere, but usually you do not. Every people, whether you go to the Boom in Southern Africa, whether you go to China, Malaysia, wherever you go, Eskimos people have what's called an origin story, an origin myth. But it's only there that they have this flood. Well, what was the real flood? Dated by carbon-14 and repeatedly redated. It was about 8,600 years ago. It was the flooding of the Black Sea when the Mediterranean topped a natural land barrier and started spilling over into an area that was undersea water but had some freshwater small lakes and a lot of human habitation. But you know, when a sea reaches something like that, it then digs through and finally comes over at great speed. And it recently sent dirigibles down there, and sure enough, there are whole villages buried down there, visible with the help of submersibles. The Bosphorus Channel is what we believe was the channel that led to this flood. The depth of the water now is roughly a half a kilometer. There's evidence that fleeing people from that area may have colonized sections of Europe, because suddenly we see at that time new ways of doing agricultural technology which developed in that area. Now I have other points that I would like to make and that I hope will come out both in the questions that I posed about Hovind and you back to me and your own questions and answers. But all I'm saying to you now is this is an argument between two very different approaches to religion and two somewhat different uses of science. He's an attacker of science, an opponent of science. I'm a scientist. He is not a scientist. He does not do scientific work. He does not predict events and so forth in science. He does his work explicitly to try to cast doubt on science, to bring people back to what is to me a very simple-minded and not very mature approach to religion. Thank you.
Science. I taught it for 15 years. I want to cast doubt on pseudoscience, and I'm convinced that evolution, mixed in with our science books, is one of the dumbest and most dangerous religions in the history of the world, and has no business being included with science books. So I'm not against science, I'm just against evolution, just to set the record straight. Anyway, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for putting this together. You did go through some obstacles to get this here, didn't you? You need to get her story about what all happened on this. Okay, back in 1831, Charlie Darwin set off on a voyage to sail around the world. He graduated from Bible college to be a preacher. The only degree he ever got, by the way, and I'm sure Dr. Trivers considers Darwin a scientist, even though he never got a science degree. Darwin, as he sailed around the world, stopped off at the Galapagos Islands right there. There on those islands, he noticed 14 varieties of finches based on their beak shape. They were all finches, the same species of bird, He studied the birds carefully by measuring their beak shape and size, and decided probably all these finches had a common ancestor. I would agree, Charlie. It was a bird. And based on the variations of beak shape, well, this study was tested again, by the way, by the Grants back for 10-year study. This is from 9 to 10 millimeters. You know how much a millimeter is? They measured the beak shape difference between wet years and dry years, and after studying for 10 years, they noticed the beak shape varies on wet years and dry years, within a few tenths of a millimeter. I agree, variations happen, but there's still a bird. Okay? Then Darwin wrote his book in 1859 called The Origin of Species. Now, the Bible doesn't talk about species, it talks about kinds, and it says if they're able to bring forth, they're the same kind. You know, a dog and a wolf can bring forth. They can mate and bring forth. A dog and a pine tree cannot. Okay? They're different kinds. Charlie observed what is sometimes called microevolution. I object to the term, and I don't think we should use it, but they do, so I'll explain it. Microevolution tells us animals and plants can produce a variety within their kind. Variations can happen. It is observable, it is scientific, it is scriptural, it's also a fact. I happen to believe microevolution, if you want to call it that, works. It's fine. The question is, does it go any farther than that? For instance, we have big dogs and little dogs. These are probably the current extremes available in the dog family, but there's still a dog. And every 5-year-old kid knows there's still a dog. I've had 5-year-old kids do this all over the world. I'll give them this picture. I'll say, here's a dog, a wolf, a coyote, and a banana. Which one is not like the others? They get it every single time, okay? It's a dog. National Geographic ran an article about how the dog evolved from a wolf. I agree. If you want to use the word evolved, it's a variety of a wolf. See, the Bible says they bring forth after their kind, and that's all we've ever observed. We're going to talk tonight about evolution. Dr. Trivers, at his request, about after life gets started, not about the first part of the evolution theory, which would have to be true. So I'm just going to put this in historical perspective for you. In order for evolution to be true, first we'd have to have cosmic evolution, the origin of time-space matter. We'd have to have an answer for that one. Then we'd have to have the chemicals evolve. There are 92 known elements naturally occurring, plus the other synthetic ones. They would have to somehow evolve from nothing, from this Big Bang, hydrogen, whatever exploded. Then we'd have to have stars evolve. Nobody's ever seen stars form. They imagine a few are forming where spots are getting brighter, but they've never proven a star is forming. It could be, of course, the dust is clearing and a star showing from behind it. The fact of the matter is that the current estimate is there are enough stars out there that we know about that everybody on Earth can own 11 trillion of them to yourself. And we've never seen the formation of one of them. We see it blow up all the time. That's the opposite, okay? Fourthly, organic evolution, the origin of life. All these are major obstacles, but I'm going to give Dr. Trivers all of these. At his request, we're going to discuss tonight, did evolution happen once life got started? Okay. I don't think any of these four are possible. I think all of them are insurmountable hurdles for the evolution theory. However, we're going to give them all of them. Next, we have to have what's called macroevolution, and this is where the argument really centers tonight. Is it possible for an animal to produce a different kind of animal, and is there any evidence that they ever have? Then we have, lastly, what's called microevolution. I agree with this one. I don't like the word, but I agree. It happens. Variations happen. I'm convinced the first 5 are purely religious. They are imagination. You have to imagine that it happened. They never are observable. They are outside the realm of science. It's part of somebody's religion. I think it's a dumb religion. But hey, this is America, the home of the free and the land of the slave, or whatever, and you can have all the religion you want, okay? But I resent paying for his religion to be taught in our schools at my expense, okay? Evolution should start a private school and teach evolution to those that want to pay and come learn it, like any other religion has to do and push their faith. This textbook changes the meaning of the word. It says evolution is change over time. And you have to define this word, because this word is slippery, okay? I agree, things change over time, but watch how they change it in the book. In other words, living things have changed over time. They're just going to automatically skip the first 4 vital stages of evolution, which would have to happen. And I'm going to skip that tonight too. I'm pointing it out. These are insurmountable obstacles. Then they say, evolution can be defined as a change in species over time. Well, now, I agree, that happens. I think species can change, but I think the species have limits. One of the lies in the textbooks is this one. That's not really what they mean by evolution. Variations certainly happen, but they have limits. Farmers have been trying for years to get bigger pigs. But they will never get a pig as big as Texas. There is a limit someplace, okay? Roaches in Florida, where I'm from, get resistant to pesticides after a while, but they will never get resistant to a sledgehammer. The point is, there are limits, and we could spend all day on that one. They still produce the same kind, and I'll stick with the Bible word kind, okay? Not species. The information for the variation was already present. You can crossbreed dogs and get a Great Dane or a Chihuahua, only because the gene code is already in the dog gene code someplace. You don't get new information added. Real evolution would be an increase in genetic complexity. By the time you get to a Chihuahua, you are swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool. They have lost a lot of information. And Chihuahuas would not last in the real world, by the way. Go ahead, make my day, he's thinking. Anyway, real evolution would require an increase in genetic complexity. I would like Dr. Trivers to give us an example of one increase in genetic complexity that's ever been observed. This question was asked to Richard Dawkins. I saw it on videotape. They asked him the question, can you give an example of evolution where there's been an increase in genetic complexity? He was dead quiet for 19 seconds and finally said, shut the camera off, please. He can't think of one. I can tell you why. There aren't any, okay? There are variations of corn, but they're still corn, okay? You're never going to get away a large tomato hamster to grow on your corn stalk, okay? There's a variety of wolves, and they had probably a variety of dogs, probably had a common ancestor. This Irish textbook calls it divergent evolution. Oh, come on, it's still a dog. Don't give it a fancy name. It's a dog. It's not divergent evolution. It's a variety of dog. This Mexican textbook says this is evolution from a common ancestor, the horse and the zebra. Nobody argues with that. It's a variety of horse. And there are a lot of varieties of horses available today. Little tiny ones and great big ones. You can crossbreed horses, zebras. You can get zorses, zonkies, yonis, z-dogs, and shebras, depending on how you cross them. I agree, but you can't cross a horse and a banana or a pine tree or an elephant, okay? Kentucky Derby has proven in the last 100 years, they've gone from an average winning speed of 127 to an average winning speed of 123. They've proven there's probably a limit to horse speed. And there's been a lot of money spent on Kentucky Derby trying to get faster horses. I mean, if anything would have shown us evolution, this would have been it. And nothing has changed other than just a little tiny bit faster. They probably have come close to reaching the limit of horse speed. There's a variety of cows, I agree, a variety of chickens. This magazine offers chickens for sale. You want to get cinnamon queens, red rocks, white rocks, cherry eggers, but then it says on the next page, jumbo fowl are the original bird from which all varieties and strains of domesticated chickens are derived. Did you know all the chickens had a common ancestor? It was a chicken. There are 8 kinds of bears in the world. They might have had a common ancestor. I don't know. But it'd be a bear if it was. Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts had a common ancestor, but it was a plant. This is not really evolution. There's an English walnut tree grafted on top of a black walnut stump. They do this all over California because of the English walnut nuts are better and black walnut roots are better. But you can never graft an English walnut tree on the back of a turtle. My whole point is, there are limits, okay? They're both walnut trees. Exactly what the Bible says. They bring forth after their kind has proven true in 6,000 years of observed human history. Now, he wants to believe, or any of you want to believe, that there's been something other than this happen. You're welcome to believe that. But you just left science and went to fairy tale and don't even realize the problem. Evolution is a fairy tale for grown-ups. It's not a science. Let's see. One more thing here. I collect textbooks. I happen to love the field of science. I've taught it for years, and I study it avidly, okay? There's no evidence to support evolution except things that have been proven wrong a long time ago. If some real evidence exists, I want you to show me. Now, last time I debated Dr. Trivers, and again tonight, he mentions several branches of science. You know, astronomy, biology, he throws out these words. He says, I don't believe in them. I do believe in them, okay? I do believe in real science. And I don't want you to just throw out a generic term and say, well, biology proves evolution. I want you to give a specific example, a real specific example of what proves evolution. If I had a theory, and I said, I think the moon is made of green cheese. Anybody can have any theory they want, okay? But then suppose I said, NASA proved it when they went there in 1973 on a secret mission. Now I'm using lies to support my theory. It's okay to have a theory, but it's not okay to lie to support the theory. It'd be even worse for me to force everybody else to pay tax dollars to support me while I lie. I am convinced that the stuff that's used in the textbooks to support the evolution theory has all been proven wrong. It's a lie. I'm open for evidence. I'm open for discussion. I want to see some evidence for evolution. They say we've got evidence from fossils. Dr. Trivers mentioned that tonight. This is silly. Absolutely no fossil could possibly count as evolution. Think about it. Imagine you're in a court of law. You bring in your bones out you found in the dirt. You say, Your Honor, these bones are the ancestors of somebody today. They would laugh at you. You can't prove those bones had any kids. You sure can't prove they had different kids. Why on earth would you think a bone in the dirt can do something animals today can't do? Dogs produce dogs, cats produce cats. No fossils count as evidence for evolution. And this is the biggest evidence they've got. And they'll bring it up 10 more times tonight, I'm sure, that fossils prove evolution. I'm telling you, just from a purely logical perspective, no fossils could possibly count. Think about it. In a court of law, they wouldn't hold up 2 seconds. Okay? Evolution's dead. Some followers have a hard time letting it go. They lie to make think everybody's fine. Oh, he never looked better. Oh, pulse and heart rate feel good. Now, I'm not saying Dr. Trivers specifically lies. I don't know if he does or doesn't. But I know the evidence to support evolution in the textbooks is lies. And if he teaches that evidence after he knows it's been proven wrong, then he's a liar. I've never called him a liar, and I wouldn't unless he lied. Okay, I don't know that he has. But if he uses some of these lies to support his theory, then it's incorrect, and he should do that at his expense, not everybody else's expense. Okay, textbooks will say natural selection or mutations is part of the process of evolution. I disagree. Mutations don't produce anything new. All they do is scramble information that's already existing. It's not an increase in genetic complexity, that's for sure. You have all kinds of examples of mutants, but they're not increasing genetic complexity. For instance, this textbook shows a fly, and it says normal fruit flies have 2 wings. This mutant has 4. This rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful. Beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Excuse me. Why don't they give an example? Why don't they show a picture of a beneficial mutation? I would like you tonight, Dr. Trivers, to name at least 2 or 3 proven beneficial mutations that increase genetic complexity. Because you would have to have trillions of those to get your theory to work, to go from a rock to a human, over 4.6 billion years. Now, the one that they always give is sickle cell anemia. Here we go. This professor said, sickle cell anemia proves evolution. Because people who get, in Africa, who get sickle cell anemia cannot get malaria, or at least are less likely to get malaria. I said, well, that's brilliant, sir. That's like saying if you cut off your legs, you can't get athlete's foot. You know, that's not an increase in genetic complexity. It's a loss of information. In both cases, it's a loss of information. It's not a gain of information. We're talking about natural selection. Natural selection selects. It doesn't create a thing. And they keep using this natural selection as evidence for evolution. Natural selection is a selective process. It's not going to create anything. We go through this for days on videotape number 4. Selecting doesn't create a thing. Okay. The peppered moth is used in the textbooks as evidence for evolution. They tell the kids, they counted the moths on the trees and found it was 95% white moths and 5% black. And then when they burned coal in the factories, the trees turned black, so they counted the moths again. And now it was 5% white and 95% black. The truth of the matter is, the whole story is a phony. It didn't happen. After 40 years of watching, they found a total of 2 moths on the trees. 2. So they glued dead moths to a tree trunk to take that picture for your kid's textbook. This is a lie, been proven wrong years ago. It ought to be taken out of the textbooks. Even if it were true, it's still a moth, and it's still the same 2 colors of moth. It's a variation of the population percentage. It's not evolution. That's not evidence for evolution. But they still keep this in the textbooks because they don't have anything else. Okay, let's see. All the evidence that they give, I am convinced, has been proven wrong a long time ago. Let's see. Get a couple of things here. They tell the kids that fruit fly is evidence for evolution. They put the flies in the laboratory and nuked them and microwaved them and x-rayed them and did all kinds of mean things to make those flies have mutated babies. They got flies with curled wings. They fly around, couldn't go anywhere. They got flies with no wings. What do you call that? Crawl. You can't fly, okay? But after raising all these mutated flies, they concluded there were absolutely no improvements. The natural limits to biological change. Dr. Lester said, fruit flies refuse to become anything but fruit flies under any circumstances yet devised. Well, duh. It's true fruit flies produce a variety of babies, but every variation they got was worse off. And this guy publishes an article in U.S. News and World Report and says flies in the north have wings 4% larger than flies in the south, and that is proof of Darwin's theory. You've got to be kidding. They tell the kids to think critically. Oh, we can spend an hour on that one. They don't think critically. They don't think at all. Okay. They say evidence for evolution comes from homologous structures, from the forelimbs of birds, dolphins, and humans, from vestigial structures, and from molecules, proteins. Well, now, we could take all those and spend all night, but the evidence for homology is right here in the textbook. It says the human has two bones in the wrist, called the radius and the ulna. There they are, boys and girls. And the penguin has two bones in his liver, called the radius and ulna. Yep, that proves we got a common ancestor. That's the message they get across in the textbooks. These homologous structures provide evidence that these animals evolved from a common ancestor. Talks about the crocodile limb, same thing, okay, it goes over and over. Seal's liver, here it is. Comparative anatomy provides further evidence of evolution. Commonality suggests that these and other vertebrate animals are all related. They probably evolved from a common ancestor. Now, if somebody wants to believe that, honestly, I don't care what they believe, that's perfectly fine. But that's not science. It probably proves they have a common designer. Similarities might prove the same designer made them. Hello? It's not proof of a common ancestor. Students are never shown there are other options. They're being brainwashed, not educated. This is all over the world. There's a textbook from Latvia, one from Ireland. It's all over the world. The same stuff. In Russia, I've been to 30 countries. They use the same stuff over and over and over. Similar design might prove the same designer made them. Let's see. I'm going to run out of time. They say we've got evidence from development. This is still used in textbooks all over the world, proven wrong in 1874. Here, this guy said the similarity between early stages in development helped convince Darwin that all forms of life shared common ancestors. Darwin considered this by far the strongest class of facts in favor of his theory. What they're talking about here is the embryonic development of different creatures. This Irish textbook says the presence of fish-like structures in embryos of different species shows these animals have evolved from fish and share the basic pattern of fish development. Are they saying the human goes through the fish stage? Yes, they are. The evolutionary idea that sick mind Freud relied on most heavily in the manuscript is the maxim that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is the embryo goes through the gill slit process here. That is, the development of the individual recapitulates the evolution of the entire species. This is baloney. It's been proven wrong 128 years ago. The embryo has these folds of skin right there, and this textbook says they have gills like a fish. That's a lie. Those are not gill slits. Those little folds of skin later develop into bones in the ear and glands in the throat. They never have anything to do with breathing. I've seen people with 5 or 6 chins, and they can't breathe through any of them but the top one. Those are not gill slits. Hegel made up this entire stupid idea right after he read Darwin's book. Darwin's book was translated to German in 1860. Hegel read it and said, what a great theory. If only we had some evidence. Now, Hegel happened to be an embryology professor at the University of Jena in Germany. He had access to photographs and drawings of all kinds of animals in their embryonic development stage. So he took a drawing of a dog and a human and he changed them and made them look exactly alike. He lied and admitted later that he lied. He made huge posters of his fake drawings to travel all over Germany to prove evolution was a fact. Now, on top of Hegel's drawings, underneath are photographs. Actual photographs by Dr. Richardson in, what's the school in England? One of the Oxford, there's about 20 colleges in Cambridge. I was just there a few weeks ago. Anyway, I'll get it there. I got it. Hegel, at the University of Jena, his own university tried him for lying. They tried one of their professors. He said, I should feel utterly condemned were it not that hundreds of the best observers and biologists lie on the same charge. It's okay for me to lie because everybody else lies. This phylogenetic law cannot be weeded out in spite of having demonstrated to be wrong by numerous subsequent scholars. The biogenetic law is as dead as a doornail, American Scientist magazine. Here it is, St. George Hospital Medical School in London. This is the guy who did took the pictures, Richardson. He said, Hegel confessed the drawing from memory and was convicted of fraud, but the drawings persist. Why did they keep this in the books? Hegel's exact chart was used in the textbook used in University of West Florida in Pensacola just last year. They're still teaching this, and it's in textbooks all over the world. You see the biology book you guys have here? Do you have that with you tonight? It's in the 10th grade biology book. They're still teaching the embryo has gill slits. Now look, folks, I know it takes a while to get textbooks up to date. 125 years is long enough, okay? There's that page on the book, okay? Ken Miller still using it. He teaches at Brown University in Rhode Island. I debated Ken Miller once on the radio. He won't do it again. We tried everything we can to get him to debate me again. And I appreciate you doing this again. But Ken Miller is using this as evidence. 1998 textbook used in Pensacola, Florida, using the embryonic gill slits. Presence of gills and tails, the gill slits on a mammal. This is simply not true. Here's a 2000 textbook, 2001 junior high textbook. The similarities provide evidence that these three animals evolved from a common ancestor. Vertebrate embryos and similar characteristics. It's used all over the place. Gills of a fish. Humans and fish embryos resemble each other because humans and fish share a common ancestor. 5 minutes, okay. Used in college textbooks. Evolutionary history of organisms is also seen in the development of embryos. Here we go again. Now look, if you have evidence for evolution, show me. But don't use this. This is a lie, okay? This is not true. So if you got some evidence, I would like to see it. Oh man, 5 minutes and I went to the wrong, I don't have a hyperlink page here. Just give me a second. According to evolution, things get better automatically, you know? Okay, here we go. Textbooks are going to tell your kids that the appendix is vestigial. This is a lie. Your appendix is part of your immune system. It's been known for years. You need your appendix. Now, you can live without your appendix. You can live without your adenoids. You can live without your tonsils. You can live without both your arms and both your legs. It doesn't prove you don't need it. The appendix is where the immune systems are initiated for the lower colon. Growler Encyclopedia tells about that. If you take your appendix out, you got a much better chance of getting quite a few diseases. But hey, sometimes that's the best option. Get rid of it if it blew up, okay? This textbook says the whale has a vestigial pelvis. Many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. For example, the whale retains pelvic and leg bones as useless vestiges. This is a lie, proven wrong years ago. They say, just imagine whales walking around. There's the bones they're talking about right there. Just imagine the whale walking around. There they are, Cambridge University. There they are in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The whale pelvis. Yep. Just imagine them walking around. I tried, I just can't. The whale pelvis is located far from the vertebrae and has no apparent function. Whale's pelvis is evidence of its evolution from four-legged land-dwelling mammals. This is simply a lie. Those bones are necessary. They're anchor points to certain muscles attached to that allow the whales to reproduce. It has to do with getting baby whales. It has nothing to do with walking on land. So either these guys are all ignorant about whale anatomy, and they should not be writing a book about it, or they're deliberately lying, trying to find evidence for their theory to spread to your kids. Now, honestly, if there's evidence for evolution, show me. But don't use this. That's a lie. Such structures, which are considered to be evidence of an organism's evolutionary past, are called vestigial. For example, hind legs of whale are vestigial structures. There are no vestigial structures, and if there were, that would still be the opposite of evolution. That's not evidence. They talk about ambulocetus. You know what they really found for ambulocetus is the dark bones here. We could talk a long time. She brings that up during Q&A. I'm ready for that one. I'd love to see that one. Or pacacetus. There's another one. All they found was a few bones of the head. Later, when they found more bones of a different animal, they said, wow, it's like a wolf. The first one, though, they found a piece of skull, a small piece of jaw, and a few teeth. But the ear bones resemble slightly whale ear bones. That's all they needed. Proof. There's missing link right there. An ear bone. We've got in our museum a 15.5-foot python snake. At the south end, he's got little tiny claws sticking out of the body right there. These little claws are attached to a little tiny bone that goes up inside the snake's body. We also have a boa in our museum, 6.5-foot live one. You can come down and pet it if you like. But they say, this textbook says, the rudimentary hind legs of a python snake are seen in the skeletal structure. Rudimentary hind legs? Those little claws are used in mating, okay? The snake doesn't have any arms, and he can't talk, and so he's put over on you. This has nothing whatsoever to do with walking on land. Now, if you got evidence for evolution, then show me. But don't use this kind of stuff, okay? They're lying to your kids. This guy says the humans have a tailbone that is of no apparent use. I debated an atheist one time, and he said, I got proof for evolution, human tailbone. I said, sir, I taught biology and anatomy. I happen to know there are 9 little muscles that attach to the tailbone, without which you cannot perform some valuable functions. I won't tell you what they all are, but trust me, you need those muscles. I said, now, if you think the tailbone is vestigial, I will pay to have yours removed. This textbook says the coccyx, that's your tailbone, is a small bone at the end of the human vertebral column. It has no present function, and is thought to be the remainder of bones that once occupied the long tail of a tree-living ancestor. This is simply a lie, okay? Now, tonight, I would like Dr. Trivers to be very specific. I don't want him to say, biology offers evidence for evolution. I don't want to hear that. I want to see specifically what part of biology offers evidence for evolution. Don't say, geology offers evidence for evolution. Give me a specific, okay? If you want to talk about the fossil record, I'm thoroughly prepared to do that. There is no fossil record. There are fossils, but there is no fossil record. They don't come with a date on them when you dig them out of the ground. All we know is there's a lot of bones found in the dirt. I mean, billions of them. None of them indicate have changed from one to another. If you found one that looked a little different than something alive today, that still could prove an extinct species. You found a missing link. I'm telling you, in a court of law, they laugh at you for bringing up fossils. But see, evolution doesn't have to be proven in a court of law. It only has to be made believable to a bunch of students by a professor who has a very obvious academic and psychological advantage over those students. And I, for one, resent paying for that. And I think some other folks do too. Thank you so much.
Set up outside with next cards and pencils, so if you have a question, please write. First, we'll ask Dr. Hovind some questions, Dr. Hovind will give the answers, and Dr. Hovind, that'll be for about 10 minutes. And then Dr. Hovind will ask Dr. Trivers some questions, and Dr. Trivers will give the answers for another about 10 minutes. So, Dr. Trivers?
Respond with a few comments on the performance we've just seen. Dr. Hovind has a gift for humor, but some of it's so grossly inappropriate that it reveals some of the deeper biases of his work. And let me give you an example of it. He says that the notion that a gene that causes sickle cell anemia found at increased frequencies in sections of West Africa and other parts of the world that have a high incidence of malaria is a foolish notion, and that this would be a beneficial mutation, because he says getting sickle cell anemia to save yourself from malaria is like cutting off your foot to avoid what was an athlete's foot. Well, that was very funny. But, yeah. You're welcome. But it's nonsense. And it's deeply insulting if you actually follow through the logic to the biological characteristics of other people. An issue I want to return to a little bit later when I get a chance to question this character. Malaria is not athlete's foot. Malaria kills over 5 million people every year. It is a dreadful, debilitating disease. Sickle cell anemia is also a dreadful condition, but as Dr. Hovind surely ought to know, the protection from malaria occurs if you have a single sickle gene and your other gene is the normal gene. That is your heterozygous. You have variability. Then you get the best of both worlds. You are protected from malaria and you have nearly the same capacity to carry oxygen in your blood as an individual with two normal genes. It's only when you are recessive for the sickle trait, that is, have both sickle traits, that you actually suffer from sickle cell anemia. One of the problems that creationists have had, and I don't know whether this is true of this man or not, I'll find out a little bit later on, is difficult in explaining racial differentiation and difficult in admitting that races have been selected in different environments in different ways and that they are not to be hierarchically arranged, but are each better suited to the world they found themselves in than the other groups. How all of this took place in the 4,000 years plus that he allows since the flood, I have no idea. He asserts that mutations never produce anything new, which is nonsense on the face of it. He showed you lots of mutations that were new. He said they're never beneficial, which he defines, if I understood him right, as causing increasing genetic complexity. But that's not the way any biologist defines beneficial. Beneficial is simply, does it increase your chances of surviving and reproducing? Sometimes having your genes be more complex does that, and sometimes being less complex. Our ability to map complexity, genetic complexity, on individual differences or differences between species is still extremely primitive. We have only recently shown by the whole genome mapping that the number of genes in the mouse and the number of genes in our cells is virtually identical. So if you think there's a difference in complexity or level of biological organization between a mouse and a human being, I happen to, you're not going to find it in increased genetic complexity. It ain't there. Now, he wants to name me a beneficial mutation. I can name you hundreds, depending on the species or the context. In the case of bacteria, many mutations have appeared and spread in the face of antibiotics. They were not caused, as I've read Dr. Hovind assert somewhere, I believe, by the antibiotics. They were selected when the antibiotics appear. And as most of you must know now, the evolution of resistance to antibiotics is a major and growing problem in medicine. We now often have to hit the same disease that could have been killed with one antibiotic. We have to hit the individual with 3 different antibiotics, cut it in 3 different directions to kill the organism. Why? Because beneficial mutations have occurred from the standpoint of the bacteria, which conferred greater survival and reproduction in the face of the antibiotics. Bacteria are not trying, so to speak, to benefit our cells. Endless examples. A recurrent mutation in Australian blowflies, for example, it was kept at low numbers and been studied for a number of years. Australia has excellent genetics. And then suddenly along came a pesticide used against other creatures which happened to hit the blowfly, and lo and behold, this mutation just happened to give resistance to it. It increased very rapidly in frequency in 20 years until virtually every blowfly had it, and simultaneously it was incorporated into the phenotype or the structure much more efficiently. So other genes had been selected for that counteracted its negative effects so that the organism could enjoy just its negative effects. I don't want to give more examples. They're endless. And it is a lie, if I may use the language of this character, to imply otherwise. Now, oh Lord. All right. There's a dreadful confusion. There's a dreadful confusion throughout his presentation between types of organisms, species of organisms, varieties within species, and so on. Darwin's finches, well, he thinks they all came from a common ancestor, but they're all a bird. Yeah, but they're all different species. They don't interbreed with each other, and the bird that they came from is sometime in the more distant past. Now, he says, you know, a dog's still a dog. Well, that's a great point. He says broccoli, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts are still a plant. He says you can't graft a tree onto a hippopotamus. I mean, what is that teaching us exactly? The fact of the matter is that evolutionary logic assumes that natural selection has a period of time to work before species are formed. And if in the short period of time that we have selectively bred plants, we can produce broccoli, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts, which are all in the same species, not just a plant, they're members of the same species, they interbreed, it is natural to wonder if 500 years, or 5,000 years, or 50,000 years of the same selection couldn't produce organisms way beyond interbreeding with each other, which is the origin of new species. Have we actually done this in real time? Yes, we have, it turns out. Busy beavers in their laboratory have bred fly species that no longer can interbreed with the original species from which they came, and which are, by definition, new species. They had to breed very specifically for traits that would cause isolation from species. So this is just sort of ridicule and verbal amusement, but has no contact with reality. 2 minutes? Okay, I'll just make 2 more points. He tells us that unless you can see evolution taking place, in other words, unless you can go back in a time capsule and actually sit there and watch it happen, and then fast forward a few hundred years, and then a few hundred more, and then see it, if you can't do that, then the whole thing's fantasy, you left time. That is not true. And if it were true, then an atomic bomb dropping on your head would be an example of a fairy tale that happened to turn out to be true. Atomic phenomena are not visualized and seen to the degree that he wants you to see scientific phenomena, but they're certainly a part of science. You cannot see a star being born because it takes, by any reasonable calculation, tens and hundreds of millions of years to take place, and you don't live that long. Now, he tells me at the outset, oh, he's going to give me these other kinds of evolution. He'll just concentrate on biological evolution as I wanted, but he hadn't given me nothing, because he still wants to start the Earth 4,000, 5,000 years ago, so he hadn't given me nothing. Those other disciplines say that the planet existed about the universe 15,000 years, the planet 15 billion, the planet 5 billion. So nothing happened until 4,000 years ago, and then living creatures appeared all at once. Most implausible. The gill slit stuff is a little sideshow that I can get into later if you want. The immune system contribution to the appendix is grossly overrated. As for the notion that the whale, that you are looking at a vestigial pelvis there, that's not a fantasy completely. We have a fossil record. He tells us it's not a record, just a bunch of bones. We have bones of creatures, and they go downward in time, deeper and earlier sediments, also timed by timing mechanisms that are consistent, that show whale-like creatures with bigger pelvises, whale-like creatures with pelvises and limb bones, whale-like creatures, although less whale-like, with the actual bones sticking out in the flippers, and we even have lineages that strongly suggest which group they came from, which I think were cattle-like creatures, small cattle-like creatures. That's my response to what I've heard so far.
I'd like to find out from the audience, how many of you heard in the last 10 minutes him call upon time to be the savior of the theory, in that, well, of course we don't see it happen because it takes too long. Of course we don't see evolution happen because it takes, too long. How many of you caught that in the presentation? So in other words, we don't see it happen. Now that's what I said at the beginning. You have to imagine that evolution happened. It takes place in the imagination. This is no different than a fairy tale for kids, long ago and far away. That's what evolution is. If you want to believe, well, it could happen if you have enough time, well, then go ahead and believe that. See, science deals with things you can observe and test and demonstrate. Evolution is not science. It's a fairy tale for grown-ups. That's all it is. And many evolutionists have admitted that. I can't hit every point we have here, these debates will go for 20 hours and still not solve it. Let me just give one or two more. The fossil record. Evidence of evolution from the fossil record. This is silly. As I mentioned earlier, there is no fossil record. There are fossils. And I have a huge collection of fossils. I happen to like digging fossils. I went to Colorado 2 months ago digging up a dinosaur. There's no question. There are fossils. The question is, what do they mean? It's his interpretation he wants to put on the fossils. And I want to put an interpretation on the fossils. But the fact is, there is no fossil record. There are just fossils. Okay? It's evidence. This guy says evolution is a fact. The fossil record provides one of the strongest evidence that species evolved over time. This is silly. You don't look back in the fossil record. You look at bones in the dirt. And you put your interpretation on them. That's all you do. Okay? This textbook says fossils can contribute to our understanding of evolution. That's ludicrous. Darwin even said, if my theory be true about slow gradual changes, numberless intermediate varieties must assuredly have existed. Change from a rock to a human. There have to be lots of missing links. This guy said, since Darwin, many links have been found. I don't think so. David Roth said, in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, these have not been found. Yet the optimists would die hard. It's pure fantasy scripted in textbooks. Pure fantasy. What creationists are asking for is a simple evolutionary criteria that would support macroevolution in the fossil record. This would be at least 40 to 50 successive fossil species showing major generic change. 12 origins doesn't list a fraction of that number, but it isn't an unrealistic number if fossils can be as old as the macroevolution is maintained. Berlinski said there are gaps in the fossil graveyard, places where there should be intermediate forms, but where there's nothing whatsoever, it said. No $1 billion intelligence writing in English, French, German, or German, denies this is so. It's simply a fact. Darwin's theory and the fossil record are in conflict. According to Stephen Gould at Harvard, he said, as Darwin noted in Origin of Species, an abrupt emergence of arthropods in the fossil record during the period presents a problem for evolutionary biology. There are no obvious simpler or intermediate forms, either living or in the fossil record. We will all say there are no transitions between any different kinds of animals. There's no transitions before the fish came from. The transition from spineless invertebrates to the first backbone fish is still shrouded in mystery. Where did all the birds come from? The true origin of birds is still up in the air, but who's just one of the world's experts on birds? How about the whales? The evolutionary origin of whales remains controversial among zoologists. What about flowering plants? We can talk about all the different fossil. The fossil record, even if there were a date stamp on it, even if they were billions of years old, still wouldn't prove any relationship. If I get buried right on top of a Hampshire, that doesn't prove he's my grandpa. So even if they are in order, which they're not, but he thinks they are, okay, even if they were in some kind of order, that still wouldn't prove an evolutionary relationship. Luther Sunderland asked major evolutionists all over the world, where's the evidence for evolution? He asked Hovind Patterson, who's got access to the largest fossil collection on planet Earth, the British Museum of Natural History. He said, Dr. Patterson, I read your book about evolution. I noticed you didn't show any missing links. Why not? Where are the missing links? Here's Patterson's response. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay on the line there is not one such fossil. There are no missing links, folks. Whole chain is missing. The Gould said the absence of fossil evidence is a nagging problem for evolution. Boy, if there is, we've got a great theory, only has some evidence. That's why it led Richard Gouldsmith 60 years ago, to say, the first bird hatched a reptilian egg. We'll find missing links, so it must happen quickly. That's ludicrous. They tell these kids to think critically. The fossil record shows that organisms evolved through many small changes over time. That's a lie, by the way. Which theory best describes an organism's evolution? Gradualism or punctuated equilibrium? Explain. This is not learning to think critically. They're giving the kid two options. Which is it? Did evolution happen slowly or did evolution happen quickly? They do this in textbooks all over the place. According to the theory of gradualism, new species evolved slowly. According to punctuated equilibrium, new species evolved rapidly. Did it happen slowly like Darwin or quickly like Gould? They don't seem to be capable of thinking outside the box. It didn't happen. They give the kids two options. Did evolution happen slow or quick? Which one, kid? How about none of the above? This is not education. This is indoctrination. This is Soviet style. I debated Dr. Trivers from UT Knoxville. I said, Dr. Trivers, he studied evolution of plants for 10 years. He got $650,000 in grant money. He studied evolution of plants. What's the best evidence for evolution? He said, evolution of whales. Now, you're a biologist and anthropologist, probably 3 times now you refer to whales as evidence for evolution. You're outside your field. There is no evidence, and I'm telling you, there is no evidence in whales he's referring to. He didn't want to mention the names, because I got stuff on, I'm sure, Amblocebus, Apacebus, and the other Basilosaurus, all of which, he even mentioned that came from a cow-like animal. You know how many changes after you go from a cow to a whale? Cows have their nose on the front of their head, okay? Whales have theirs on top. Don't you see a little prow moving it from one place to the other? And how's he going to live in the meantime? And this is just dreaming. This is pure imagination. Now, I don't care if he wants to believe that, honestly. If he wants to think cows turn to whales, honestly, that doesn't bother me. It only bothers me that he wants to use our tax dollars to make the kids think that that's part of science. Is anybody else bothered by that in here tonight? Okay. Anyway, so I think Dr. Trivers said one of the best evidence is revolution. Okay. He said the hippo is evidence for evolution because it's in the process of adapting to an aquatic way of life. He says the flying squirrel is evidence because it has half a wing. Why you all don't believe that? The textbook we look at tonight, used in this school, says talks about the moose being evidence for evolution because it likes to live in the water. It's headed back to the water. It's going to be the whale someday. Some of the things he covered tonight, we've been talking about for days and days. I'm not going to get you all over here. He mentioned that I bring up pseudo-facts and pseudo-science. Of course, I resent that. I try to be very careful with my facts. And if I do something, I want to be specific and not generic. If you think the evolution of whales is evidence for evolution, then we can discuss whales tonight. Okay, I've got plenty of material on that. But I'm telling have no fossil, it's going to count. Think about it. If you find a bone that looks kind of like a fox and it's got a whale, an ear bone that looks kind of like a whale's ear bone, is that proof that the fox evolved to a whale? Anybody with half a brain and a little bit of common sense could say, no, that's not true. He might choose to believe that, which would be part of his religion. That's fine. He can have that religion. But he certainly follow what's paid for. Took too long to see. Let's see. He mentioned the beneficial mutations as bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. You can ask anybody that studied this out thoroughly. When the bacteria become resistant to antibiotics, it's because there was a loss of information in the bacteria, not a gain. The bacteria lost information. I don't interrupt you when you speak. I don't interrupt you when you speak, okay? Now, the bacteria lose information. It's like if you're handcuffing people and somebody doesn't have any arms, so you can't handcuff them. Well, that might be a benefit at that moment, but you can't handcuff them. But it's still a loss of information. The bacteria can't lock onto the mechanism because they've lost information. There's plenty of stuff on this on the Anthropology website. Whole big article about bacteria that doesn't evolve. It loses information. When they dug up the guys at Trivers that were trying to find the Northwest Passage, they found out that some of them were already resistant to penicillin. Penicillin hadn't been developed yet. How do these guys already have this resistance to penicillin in their system? That's just evidence that it's not really an increasing information, it's a loss of information. He mentioned the Australian blowfly, a mutant blowfly had some kind of benefit because of something changed in the environment. It's still a fly. Is that process, my question would be to Dr. Rivers, is the process you described of a bacteria becoming resistant to drugs, or a blowfly with a mutation being able to survive in its environment, is that process sufficient, in your mind, to change from a rock to a human, or from an ape to a human, or from an amoeba to a human, or whatever process you want to use? The fact of the matter is, there's 8 or 9,000 kinds of creatures on this planet, basic kinds of animal, and to think that they all had a common ancestor. He talks about genetic, inbreeding with people, Noah's daughters and sons marrying each other. Talk about inbreeding. He thinks everything came from a rock. What is the genetic variety in a rock 4.6 billion years ago? Man, talk about inbreeding. Okay, go take questions now.
I want to say out loud what I did say to Dr. Hovind, because he's so loose with terms like liar. He claims I call him a pseudoscientist. Maybe my memory's even worse than I thought, but I don't remember calling him that. He's not a scientist. He's not a pseudoscientist. He's not a scientist, period. But never mind that. Why does everybody think he was a liar on? Because he does this, and he does it frequently. He speaks with authority about things that he either does not know, or in this case, probably deliberately misrepresents. And that's the notion that bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics have invariably lost information. There's surely a case or two where they have, but we know there are many where they have not. They trade the information between themselves. You don't trade lack of information very easily between yourselves. It's an unusual characteristic of bacteria that they're capable of doing this. And there are special mechanisms that I won't bore you with that permit this. It is simply not true that this is a loss of information. If I give you a blowfly as an example of beneficial mutation, he turns around and says, well, is it a new species? That wasn't the point. The point was there are such a thing as beneficial mutations, and when he claims otherwise, he is, to put it gently, misrepresenting reality. Now, let me ask you a few questions. I hope you can just get short answers on this. Is Noah's Ark a fantasy for adults?
I believe the Noah's Ark story is literally true. I think it's logical to think that one person and his family could put 2 of each kind and 7 of some kinds onto a boat. I think it is much more logical than to think everything came from a rock 4.6 billion years ago. Yes, I believe the story is literally true.
Okay, now I just want to point out the double game this person is playing. Namely, if I cannot see something with my own eyes, namely evolutionary change over long periods of time, which by definition you cannot see, then I've left the world of science and I'm in the world of fantasy, right? He believes that something is inherently true. He has not seen it with his own eyes. He cannot see it with his own eyes. He's just happy with it. He thinks it's logically consistent. That ain't science. That is, according to him, a fantasy for adults. Period.
This is question and answer time. You're supposed to ask me a question and give me a chance to respond. So,
All right. Go ahead. Okay, I have this question before you respond. All right, then, give a quick response to my response.
if I were asking for the taxpayers to pay for the Noah's Ark story to be taught in the school, then the burden of proof would be on me to prove the story is true. I'm not asking for that. You are asking for the taxpayers to pay for the Amoebas and man molecules to be taught.
Money. That's nonsense. That's a fantasy of his. And besides, it's once again distracting attention from the issue. Is it a fantasy for adults? Very much. Now let me ask you this. Where, given all this massive inbreeding that happened in species after species after species after species after species, including ourselves, where did all this genetic variability come from that characterizes all outbreeding species today?
I think I showed you from
Excuse me.
I showed everybody from the magazine.
We're being polite to both
There's quite a few varieties of chickens, and they
We're being polite to both
no, they all came from a common ancestor, which was a chicken. I had a family who came to my seminar once. They've been involved in dog breeding for 4 generations. They said, Hovind, for 100 years, our family has raised dogs. We are convinced if you give us 10 or 15 generic dogs, we can recreate every breed on the planet in less than 100 years. Sure, variations happen, but they're limited. They're still the same kind. So I think the evidence to go from 2 basic kinds on Noah's Ark to 200 varieties of dogs today is very doable, number one. It's all still a dog. Most of them wouldn't survive in the wild. They're made by humans for some particular reason. They wouldn't survive in nature. And it's still minor compared to changing from a rock to a human, real minor.
Well, again, he's failed to deal with the question at hand.
Well, give it to me again.
It is quite, I will, let me just deal with the nonsense and talk out in the meantime. It is quite true that if you take 14 different breeds of dogs, you regenerate almost everything, because they're genetically quite different, even though they're all inbred within the lineage. So when you cross them with each other, you have an enormous amount of genetic variability with which to deal with. He has jumped forward to chickens and dogs right now and failed to answer the question, which I'll state again for you, Dr. Hovind. Right after the flood, when these poor creatures had to find the world again to live in, and had to inbreed, how went all the genetic variability? How did it get regenerated so quickly in your worldview?
Well, you're sitting on what's called a straw man. They don't have to inbreed. The first generation, they married sisters. After that, they married cousins. After that, they married second or third cousins. So it's not a problem. Darwin married his first cousin intentionally, because even until the 1850s, they thought you'd get better children if you married close to the family. So it's been, throughout history, there were kings that had to marry royalty. The Habsburg family is an example, but it's required to marry royalty just a few hundred years ago. Sometimes they married their sister. They thought they would get increased gene pool. So it's not correct that after X number of generations, everything goes bad. But it is, it's also you're saying with a straw man to say that they had to inbreed. First generation, they're marrying sisters. After that, it's cousins, and etc. And I think if you don't believe that all humans are related, this would quickly lead to the racist philosophy that races are radically different and evolve somehow differently, and therefore you're headed down the path Adolf Hitler called it to become, one race is superior. I would be careful of that one.
Okay. Well, again, he's failed to deal. Get your diction on Adolf while you can here. I'll come right back to races and see how you actually think about them. But I just want to point out, this is no dealing with the problem at all. You have siblings made together, you reduce genetic variability immediately by a quarter, when the next generation does it by another quarter, etc. The fact is that you've got inbred lineages, inbreeding. You can do the calculations, trivial within population genetics. It's not an area of biology you master, and so you end up talking about whether rocks increase. Now, I think I'll skip another piece of science that is, I think, beyond you in terms of synonymous sites in genetics, and why do they tell time that matches exactly the time that geologists give, and which matches paleontological time as well. But let's turn to the races. I'm just curious how you fall out on this view. How did they get generated? We're starting with Noah and his wife and his children. How so quickly, and absent any beneficial mutations, and with this appalling record of inbreeding that wipes out variability, how did you get this wonderful variability in our species, including the Chinese, the Africans, the Asians, the Africans, the Europeans? How did you get it? No beneficial mutations, etc.
First, I guess I object to the term race. I think there's one race, it's called the human race. I think it's quite obvious, anybody who's been around, all of the so-called races are certainly interfertile and can breed with each other. So there is not really, the concept of race is pretty much overblown. There are just skin colors, okay? These are not different races of cows here because they are, different skin colors, okay? They all look the same in the meat locker and they all taste the same on a hamburger. So, with that said, there are four basic theories of where the races came from. I believe probably the Bible illustrates the best, gives the best option. At the Tower of Babel, within the first few hundred years after the flood, the Bible says God confounded them by their languages, by their nations, and by their families. In that case, you get people breaking up into small groups of maybe a few hundred, and they all speak, French or German or Italian or whatever. And then there would be probably quite a few things that would cause different racial traits to become pronounced. Sometimes it's a mutation, like, for instance, extra pouch of fat in the eyelid that causes Oriental people to have more slanted eyes. It's no different than anybody else, other than it's something they have. The Norwegians, for instance, have typically blonde hair. The Aborigines have very small calf muscles. The Indians have high cheekbones. There are quite a few varieties that we call racial traits that actually are so minor compared to the idea we all came from a rock.
Welcome back to the top. Let me just, I've virtually exhausted my time. The rock of ages, I guess I have to think of it, because that's his answer to everything. Let me ask one last thing, Dr. Hovind. You spent a lot of time disproving evolution, or at least casting doubt on evidence in favor of it. I gather you don't prove the recent creation thing so much as just say you read in the Bible, and so it's kind of a convincing story to you. But let me ask you this. Has creation science ever predicted a thing